Well, welcome everybody. We have a great day planned for you. We have two different events coming up today. The first one, we're going to explore your options for the 1031 exchange. So this is an event that's brought to you by H&S Wealth. They've been working with AOA, advertising with us for over 20 years, and we've had nothing but good feedback from our members about them. And so they're a great organization, and very happy. It's really a pleasure for them to come on today. And also want to tell you, we have an upcoming event right after this. It is about the tenant relief. And so if you're specifically Orange County, San Bernardino, LA County, that area, they'll be able to answer specific questions for you. All of our streams are live and with a live Q&A. And so that's kind of a specific thing about us. And so before I introduce our speaker, I just want you to know that there's a little chat, a little blue button that says help. If you're on the AOAUSA.com website, you'll be able to just click on that, put in your question. If you're on YouTube or Facebook, you know how to put a comment in, and all those questions will come to me, and we can answer those questions for you after we have our speaker. Actually, today we have two different speakers, so make sure you check out our website and click on the seminars and events, because there's all different types of events. We have block coming up next week. We have a Pathway to Wealth seminar coming up. We have one on how to get ready for small claims court coming up. So there's a lot of different content that we think you will need, since you can't evict people and you're going to have to pursue them in small claims court. So anyway, subscribe on YouTube. Go subscribe to the e-newsletter. It doesn't cost anything to do it. So go ahead, get those things for free, and we're going to help keep you in the know with that. And so anyway, that's the housekeeping stuff. And here we go. Our first speaker today, she works with the AOA Brokerage, Commercial Brokerage Department, and she spent 10 years as a transaction coordinator. She's very good with all the fine details, and she's put together deals from single-family homes to properties that have 100-plus unit properties. And so it's my pleasure to introduce to you today Sara Ianni.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Jeff, for the introduction. Very excited to be here today. So first, I just wanted to say my name is Sara Ianni. I am a real estate agent here with AOA Commercial Brokerage, and AOA Commercial Brokerage has been servicing apartment owners for over 40 years. We are a department in the Apartment Owners Association, and we do specialize in the sale of multifamily residential dwellings as a full-service apartment brokerage. Our office is located in the main office at AOA, so if for any reason at all you need to deal with a real estate brokerage firm that you can trust, just go ahead and give AOA a call. Our phone numbers and information is displayed on the lower screen. Give AOA a call, ask for Sara in brokerage, and they'll transfer you right over. So go ahead and just write that information, the numbers and the email down in your notes. Probably you could just have it handy, keep it handy. So I'm just going to repeat in case anybody logged on late. If you guys have any questions at all during this webinar, go ahead and feel free to type them in the chat. So whichever platform you're watching this on, if you're on YouTube or Facebook, it's just the comment box, like Jeff said. If you are watching this directly from the live stream on the AOA website, it is there's the blue oval button that says help. Go ahead and click that, and you can type in your questions there. That's really one of the benefits from watching these lives. We do keep it on YouTube and you can rewatch it, but right now the speakers are here, so go ahead and take advantage of that opportunity to just communicate with us as much as you can on the chat box. So as you know, I'm sure all you guys know, the values in real estate do go in a cycle. And my research has shown that the average full cycle spans about 18 to 19 years. So that indicates that it's about 9 years up and then 9 years down. Well, we've passed 9 years, we've passed 10 years, and the prices do not seem to be dropping yet. That's what they call a bull market. A bull market is a sustained period where the prices keep rising. They don't seem to be dropping yet. So another indicator that it's still a seller's market is also how long the properties stay on the market. And if you guys have noticed, the properties are not staying on the market very long. I have a graph. I had this graph last month, so I'm pulling it up again so we could see where we're at. This is from my local MLS. It's in the Los Angeles County because that's where I'm located. But if you guys are wondering what yours is, just contact me and we could probably figure that out. So this is from the past 5 years, this being the 5th year. As you can see, the days on market, it was the average of 25 to 30 days at the most. I mean, last year, understandably, the days on market did go up to 44, but now as the county is starting to reopen, this year it's at 31. Last month when I was up here, that days on market was at 32. So within 1 month, we've dropped 1 day, and that does indicate that it's still a seller's market. Still, we're still early on in this year, barely starting the second quarter, and I'm really curious to see what that number is going to be in December. Like I mentioned earlier, the prices do not seem to be dropping yet. Now, there are some exceptions. Buyers and investors are not just going to buy any high price listing. The numbers do have to make sense. If the property is priced right, it's easy to show. Along with a couple other variables, as a seller, you are definitely going to see possibly all cash, multiple offers, very attractive terms. To properly determine the value of your asset at this point in the cycle, I would say that there are so many different variables. Each apartment building has its own unique value. So in order to get you that property evaluation, it would be essential to have a little conversation with you prior to getting you the property evaluation. So whatever it is that you're planning to do with your building, whether you're thinking about cashing out, utilizing a 1031 exchange into a more profitable like-kind property, or you may be ready at this point in your career to exit out of this portion of the industry. And by this portion of the industry, I mean the day-to-day activities that go along with managing rental income. Yet you're understandably concerned on how to maintain your income stream or even possibly generate more income. So either way, whatever it is that you're deciding to do, the first step is to know the value of your asset. So we have no obligation property evaluations. We do provide that as AOA Commercial Brokerage. It's no obligation at all. We have a form. It looks like this, and you may have seen it. It's in our magazine, both digital and physical copy. And I think it also gets sent out in the membership packets. So these are just some of the questions that I would ask you. You know, it has a little space for the rent roll and then the address, obviously. When you're planning on doing this, is it, now? Is it someday? Is it 6 months? Just the condition of the building, stuff like that. So with this form right here, you can either scan it and email it to me. You could mail it in the old-fashioned way, or you could fax it in. Our fax number is still right there, and we will receive it. Okay, so if you don't want to deal with paper, we have this available on the website. And I also have slides for that. So for that, you would just go to our website, which is aoausa.com. Click on the brokerage tab right there up on the top. Scroll down and click free property evaluation. And then you're going to see these boxes, fill in some information, and hit submit or send, and it'll get over to us. And so that's just the paperless route. Now, if you don't want to do any of those, the last option is just call me. Our phone number's there. You can get a hold of me, call AOA, ask for Sara, and we can get started. Now, as Dan, the founder of AOA, has mentioned many times, the main goal here at AOA is that you will discover at least one idea that'll help you make and or keep more money than ever before. And if you're contemplating the possible sale of your rental income property, you may be aware that you face an enormous tax bite upon that sale. And that is bad news. But there's good news, and the good news is that the capital gains taxes can be deferred, ultimately avoided, if you have the right plans, strategies, and information in place. And that is what we plan to share with you today. So that's it for me. That's my portion of this seminar. Thank you so much for hanging out and listening to what I have to say. Up next is Bryan. He's with H&S Wealth Management. Bryan is a financial advisor, and he has been involved in the 1031 tax exchange industry since 2002. I'm going to let him introduce himself a little bit more, and thank you very much, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you for that introduction, Sarah. I really appreciate it. As you heard, my name is Adam Bryan, financial advisor with H&S Wealth Management, and I've been working with 1031 exchange investors and real estate investors in general since 2002, 19 years, specializing in 1031 exchanges. I thought today we'll talk about options for reinvesting if you're completing a 1031 exchange. I wanted to speak in general about different classes of real estate. Obviously, the members here own multifamily or residential, but whether you're looking for a new investment opportunity or you're doing a 1031 exchange and you're considering purchasing another investment property on your own or a Delaware Statutory Trust or DST property, really there's all types of assets out there in the world. But I thought it would be useful for the members to kind of maybe hear about things you don't commonly hear about when you're considering different types of real estate. And then I'll go into some specifics on the Delaware Trust that I specialize in and the types of Delaware trusts that I specialize in. When you do a 1031 exchange, you must reinvest in what's called like-kind property. And there's a common misconception that like-kind means I've sold an apartment building, I must buy one. I sold a shopping center, I must purchase a shopping center. That is not correct. What the IRS is referring to is income property or business held for business purposes, investment property or property held for business purpose. So, for example, you could sell your 4 units in Van Nuys and purchase empty raw land that's not even leased. As long as it's held for investment purposes, you absolutely can do a 1031 exchange. As long as it isn't your primary residence or a second home, if you own the asset, it most likely would qualify. So when I say like kind, I mean investment property, but what kind of investment property? Well, I thought what I'd do is touch on, based on my experience, I've worked with many different asset classes over the years, some little pointers and things to consider that might not be as obvious as one might think. So retail, shopping centers, grocery anchored shopping centers, strip malls. This is an area where, there's often opportunity. If you think about the number of retail sales, the entire country nationwide, and wonder if you ever thought about what percentage is happening online now. Now, I know in my house, it's nearly 100%, not just because of COVID, but we just buy everything online now. And a lot of my clients do that. But the reality is when there's been studies of the true number, and 2020, as you see on the screen, or you will in a moment, it was 19.6% in 2020. And that was up dramatically from 2019 at the 15.8%. So isn't it interesting that still 80% plus of retail sales is happening in brick and mortar stores and locations? What's really interesting is not so much that it's a small number compared to what you might have assumed, but that it's growing very rapidly. I've been talking about this for many years, and I can remember when it was 4 or 5%, and even then people thought online purchases were much higher. So the reality is, while online is absolutely changing the way business is done, and it is impacting retail real estate, it's important to think of 2 things. Number one, there are still shopping centers and strip malls, certainly more vacancies than usual, but they haven't gone away, and they aren't going to go away anytime soon. But they are going to go away, I think, at least maybe not 100%, of course, but we still have a lot of room to grow on the online space. And that online growth has the opposite effect on retail shopping centers. So that's something to think about that a lot of people don't. I think it's a bad sign, frankly, for brick and mortar retail. The other issue is grocers or grocery stores. If you think about it, my entire life I've always lived in Southern California, and up until just a few years ago, I never saw a grocery store go out of business and go dark. The only thing that might happen is that Ralph's might become a Vaughn's or vice versa. But if you think about it, you never saw that, right? Up until a few years ago. And why is that? It's not so much people buying groceries online, although that's a trend too, certainly during COVID. It's because of Super Walmart or Super Target, which is to say groceries are being sold in those locations. And by the way, Trader Joe's wasn't that prevalent just a few years ago. Or what about Whole Foods or Fresh and Easy? You see my point. There's been a change in the way groceries, the industry has been operating. It used to be that within a certain demographic area, so many thousand people, you need a grocery store to feed them. And most people tend to go to the same grocery store. So as long as that population exists, and in Southern California it's done nothing but grow until recently, you always needed that grocery store. And if you're the landlord of that grocery-anchored shopping center, you had a virtually permanent tenant that was always going to be there, generally on a long-term lease with pretty low rent. That's kind of the trade-off. But you made money on the shop space around it, the dry cleaner, the Nails by Sally, the taco restaurant. That's what made retail investment good opportunities back in the day. Between this new model of selling groceries and having an impact where we now have seen grocery stores actually close in recent years, and of course the influence of online, that's a big challenge, another big challenge for retail that might not have occurred to you. Office buildings. So, of course it depends on the economy and employment, but generally we are constantly growing, and there's always been a need for office space. Vacancies used to be in the 5 to 10% range. Real estate is local. Everything I'm talking about, there's exceptions to rules. There's opportunities where generally there might seem that there isn't. So I do want to clarify that. I can't say with any confidence that every office investment or every retail shopping center is a bad investment. I'm not saying that. But I do want you to consider these things if you're thinking about that kind of real estate. In the office space, let's see. Number one, what we've learned through COVID and through technology, again, the internet, is the ability to work remotely. We found that unless you're cutting hair or serving food or jobs like that, you might not have to be in the office. And you know what? A lot of companies are liking that. It's reducing their cost. Now, I certainly don't think that office buildings are going to go away. I think there's always going to be a need to interact face-to-face with people, and there's a lot of benefits. A lot of office space can be replaced with people working from their homes. And statistically, and when polls are done, employees like that. So it's a win-win for everyone. And that's having an impact on vacancy rates in office. Again, these are nationwide averages. Every individual market is local and different. Downtown LA is different than Riverside. But generally, as a rule, we've seen a decrease in occupancy. 2020 was especially bad because of COVID, obviously. And it rose to, according to Statistica.com, 15% vacancy rate or 85% occupancy. That's up from the 9% it was in 2019, a more average occupancy rate of 90% or 10% vacancy. So that 5% increase is perhaps short-lived. But I actually believe a lot of companies are going to let go of their office space or maybe finish out the lease and not renew. A real concern I have for office. The other thing that I skipped over was storage. If you remember in the old days, there was always the file room. And in fact, there were jobs. I had one of them, my first real job was in a law firm where you would file documents, right? We all remember that, everybody over the age of 30 at least. Well, right now, I'm old enough to say my record collection is on my phone, every single album, and I'm a big music fan. So in my example, I don't have a bookshelf full of LPs and tapes and cassette tapes and CDs. Well, offices don't need that physical space either. It's all digital now. And guess what? That's a big part of rental office space that's just not needed anymore. Very few companies have a requirement to have hard copy. It's just cumbersome and not helpful. And if there is a legal need to have it, it's usually stored off-site because you can pull it up on your computer. All of this is having a negative impact, not only now, but for the future of rental office space. So I tend to avoid it, again, as far as an asset class. What else do we have? Senior living. This is a good one. Everybody knows that everybody's getting older and the senior population is growing. In fact, I've read statistics that every day there's 10,000 new 65-year-olds. Clearly, there's a growing or a graying of America, as I'm sure you've heard, myself included. Well, that tends to give credence to the idea of investing in, it could be a senior living facility or convalescent care, housing related to seniors because of this huge demand. And also longevity. We are statistically living longer, which means that these beds are staying occupied. That's how they're referred to in the senior living space. Well, one thing that I think people don't think about when they look at the investment opportunity, and they think it's very positive because everybody's getting older, is that it's very reliant on the home pricing market by housing, regular residential homes. And you may be saying, well, what has that got to do with old people moving into senior housing? The answer is, in the class of real estate that is typically available for investment, in other words, not public government-funded senior housing, but private. How are those folks paying for that senior housing? It's upwards of $5,000 to $7,000 a month in many cases for the low end. The high end could be $10,000. How is that possible? How are people paying it when they're retired, when Social Security is a pittance? The answer is they've been able to afford that generally through the sale of their primary residence. It's very common for seniors to often have even paid off their mortgage, so they own their home free and clear. And if you're in a market like Southern California, that may well be $900,000 that individual has when they sell their home and then move into a senior living facility, and they use some of that proceed or the investments with those proceed to fund their senior housing. Well, as we all painfully recall, in 2007 and 8 through 2013 roughly, we saw a dramatic drop in home prices. Nationwide, I believe it was around 25%. Some markets were more than 50%, even in Southern California in the outlying areas. So that's the challenge or the risk, or one of them, when you're talking about investing in senior housing. It's not just that there's a lot of seniors out there, but do they have the money to afford these, not necessarily luxury, but higher end, non-publicly funded senior living facilities? And if the housing market slows down again, I don't know when that'll happen. I don't expect it to happen anytime soon, honestly, but it'll happen. And when it does, that's going to have a huge impact on the senior living community. How do I know this? Because I lived through it. I was in the investment world. I was looking at different investment properties that were senior housing that had a real hard time. There's two other things to think about. One is that you do have turnover. You lose tenants. They don't move from one to another typically. They pass away. But that means there's a guaranteed turnover of residents. You need people who can afford to replace those tenants that pass away. During the Great Recession, vacancy rates in senior housing skyrocketed. Why? Because people passed away, as they do typically every year, but there weren't the residents to come in and replace them. And that had a very negative impact on valuation and cash flow. Also, another area that's extremely important in that area is regulation and liability. In senior housing, this isn't just a regular apartment building, which is challenging enough, especially in Southern California. You have medical boards that oversee how that operation is run. And typically, if you're the landlord or the owner of a senior living facility, it's leased to an operator, and that operator is highly regulated. So, for example, there's been some real challenges in California and other states during COVID, where people weren't meeting the minimum required standard for care, and the tenant or the operator was being sanctioned financially. And that has a negative impact on the cash flow, the ability for that tenant to pay you the rent. The other example is a regulatory change. Maybe they're a good operator, but for example, and I know this happened in Texas and a number of other states, the state might decide that you can have, instead of 3 people with one nurse on duty at all times, that you could only have 2 people that are being cared for. That means you need to hire another, whether it's a nurse or a physician assistant, qualified individual, because the requirement of the state changed. Well, that has a dramatic impact again on the financials of that operator. And if that happens, that could very likely have an impact on their ability to pay you rent. And there's nothing you can do to predict this. There's nothing really you can do to mitigate it, except lower the rent, which is usually not the most favorable option. Another reason that while there is opportunity in senior housing and there is a growing senior population, I'm very wary of those types of offerings for these reasons. And again, I've seen this happen through the Great Recession and now through COVID. Student housing is another type of real estate that's often touted and that you can invest in. Like senior housing, there's constant turnover in student housing, In other words, generally for even state universities and certainly private, they want the freshmen to live on campus in the first year. That's a pretty common factor. So that means you have obviously sophomores, juniors, and seniors graduate every year. There's a graduating class and everybody moves up. That means there's constant turnover. Now that can be a good thing, because that means that if rents have risen, you're able to increase rents, right? It can also be a bad thing if those, just like the seniors, those tenants are not being replaced. And why wouldn't they be replaced? Well, once again, we come back to Bill Gates and DARPANET and the internet being responsible for a big, big change. As we all know, you can now attend school or college remotely from your home. This was happening before COVID, even for in-state students that are going to a local state school that they could drive to. Even those students statistically are attending school remotely. It's less and less necessary to physically be there. And that means if you are an owner of student housing, there's less and less demand, and that drops rent, and that loses valuation of the property. Something to consider. Senior housing also has another huge factor that's unique to student housing that's unique to student housing, and that is proximity to campus. The most valuable and desired student housing are properties that you can walk to. Now, here in Southern California, a lot of students, of course, have their own car, although not all do. And in other states, it's much less common for college students to have their own car. So being able to walk to campus from the student housing is extremely important. And of course, there's public transportation, but that's often less desirable. What that means is that the immediate area around a college, that's going to be the most expensive, the most leased, and the most desired student housing properties that are available for an investor. And guess what? They're hard to come by and they're expensive. There are opportunities for student housing, but guess what? Because of that infill requirement of being close to campus, those properties have already been built. They're already leased. They're already operating. So developers or people who convert their multifamily are further and further away from campus. And if that's the case, that you're investing in a property where a student can't walk to campus, also keep in mind half the country we're in snow for 4 months out of the year. So this is a really important factor. That's going to hurt the value and the demand for that student housing asset. Another consideration that, again, many people don't think about, they might like the school. The school might have good rising enrollment, although, again, it's dropping on physical enrollment every year nationwide. But those are things that I want you to consider if you're looking at a student housing property. Triple net is the most common. So let me explain for those that aren't aware. NNN, or net, which is what it stands for, is a type of lease. And what it means is that the tenant is responsible for the insurance on the property, for the property taxes, and generally for the upkeep of the property to varying degrees, often referred to as triple net. And usually it's a single tenant triple net property. If you Google what you want to potentially buy if you're doing a 1031 exchange or just a straight investment, what you're going to see is a lot of triple net properties. And those properties tend to be leased to companies you may know: Family Dollar, Dollar Tree, Burger King, brand names that you're aware of. And that has a great appeal to a lot of investors. Also, like the DSTs that I work with, they're passive investments. You don't have to worry about paying the mortgage, you don't have to worry about paying the taxes, reducing your mortgage, the insurance on the property. All that's handled by the tenant. If you have a loan, you do have to, of course, pay the bank. But it's passive. You don't have to deal with it. And often people are very comfortable with a brand name tenant, like I mentioned, and that's all good. But let me point out that when you do have a new lease that's a triple net lease, typically it's a 20-year term, could be even longer, 25, occasionally a 15-year term. That's pretty common. The trade-off is that you get relatively low rent compared to the market, but you have confidence that that tenant is going to be there and pay the rent every month. That's the usual structure. Now, a couple of things you have to think about, though. The most important is the terms of the lease when you purchase the property. What I see very, very commonly is that properties that were originally leased with 20 or 15 years come up for sale 5 or 10 years later, which means you have 5 or 10 years remaining on that lease term where that tenant is obligated to pay you rent. And you're going to own the property. You may wait that 5 or 10 years and hope that they renew, so they have a brand new long-term lease. But maybe you have a 10-year loan on the property and you need to sell it within 8 or 9 years since you don't want to wait till the last minute. Well, if you do that, now the time remaining on that lease, you bought it with 10 years remaining. Now there's 2 or 3 years remaining on that lease. Well, guess what? A buyer is not going to pay you more than you paid with far less time remaining on the lease, at least generally. So that to me is a depreciating asset where you want an appreciating asset. You want to see your real estate value grow, not decrease. That's the biggest challenge I see with triple net properties, whether they're individual assets that you're buying yourself for $1 million or a DST or DST portfolio of triple net properties. Unless we see 15 years on the lease or greater, number one, tend to avoid them pretty strongly. The other issue is the tenant and the tenant risk, tenant default risk that the company won't pay. Well, we all remember when Circuit City was a great tenant, right? Remember Circuit City? I could go on, right? Soup Plantation. How about Sears? The list is a mile long. A lot of companies that at one point looked very good, very solid. S&P and Moody's might have rated as a very good credit risk. 5-10 years later, had a dramatic change, especially in the retail space because of the internet challenges we talked about. Consequently, you don't know that you're going to have that tenant at all. So you have two concerns. You want that tenant to stay in the property and continue taking care of it, and you want them to renew, and you don't want to lose them. You don't want them to go out of business, because if they do, and a great example is Soup Plantation, wonderful company. As far as I know, great financials. They were a private company, but I certainly know I contributed to their wealth. At the beginning of the great pandemic that we just went through, very early on, it turns out wisely, decided to shutter, to close their doors. So guess what? Every landlord of those buildings, because I believe they were virtually all leased, I don't think they owned any of their real estate, no longer was getting paid. And that's not just the end of the story, because you may think, okay, I'll just release it. Well, I have to tell you, that's a little bit bigger deal than you might think. Something like a Circuit City or a certain fast food restaurant or certainly a Soup Plantation has a very specific configuration or build out. In other words, everybody's kind of unique. That's why when you go into a store, if it's the same chain, they all kind of look the same. Every company's different. Well, who pays to make those changes in the structure? You guessed it, it's the landlord. The term that they use in the industry is TIs, or tenant improvements. That's a tremendous expense for a building, and that could be literally hundreds of thousands, if not $1 million or more dollars, depending on the size of the asset. The other thing, as I mentioned, releasing, well, guess what? You have to pay a leasing commission, which is usually a pretty substantial sum, particularly in that first year, to whoever leases the property. Those are expenses that you didn't even think about when you had this nice leased triple net property with a great tenant paying the rent. But guess what? If the worst happens, or even if the worst doesn't happen, they just complete the term of their lease and decide not to renew, you have a very big and very expensive problem. And I got to tell you, the triple nets that are out there, again, whether you're buying them as an individual or buying them in a DST structure, they're not often in the greatest locations. Why? Because the greatest locations have been snatched up by what we call the institutions, life insurance companies, very large companies. Very rare that you're going to see a primary market triple net opportunity. What you're likely going to see, if I Googled it right now, is a tenant that may or may not have good credit in a location that you probably wouldn't otherwise want to own real estate in, and less than 15 years remaining on the lease. If that's what you're looking at, pretty much I can say as a blanket statement, you probably want to avoid that investment. There's always opportunity. What I'm saying is not an absolute, of course. Real estate is local. But as a general rule, I wanted to cover that, particularly because triple nets are so common, so well received. And the reason I believe they are is because it is a passive investment, which investors like, and because of the brand names of the tenants. You know, you see Family Dollar or Dollar Tree, and that makes you feel very confident in the tenant. Again, I have to tell you, a good example is Rite Aid was taken over by Walgreens. Great, strong credit. Boots Alliance is the English owner of Walgreens. Great credit. They're paying the leases. They actually paid the leases for the Rite Aids when they took it over, but they closed 1,300 locations nationwide. Now, they still honored the lease, but you now know that you have an empty building. You're collecting rent on it, but you're going to have to replace them, and the sooner the better, and it's going to cost you. So even a great name like Rite Aid might be a challenge for you in the long run. Okay. Let's talk about some things that I like. They have their own challenges too, but there's two particular asset classes that we at H&S Wealth Management focus most of our clients on, and that's self-storage and particularly multifamily. I'm going to leave the best for last and talk about self-storage first. Self-storage has a lot in common with multifamily. That might seem odd, and I don't mean that people are living in the units, at least they're not supposed to be. Basically, the way that it works from a leasing standpoint is that you have an initial term, like in an apartment building, 6 to 12 month lease, and then you go month to month thereafter. And why is that important? If you have month-to-month leases, you're able to refill space that vacates and move rents with the market. In other words, if rents are increasing in a given market, if you're operating your property at maximum potential, you're able to increase rents. In fact, every month you have that rollover, and that's a good thing because you're able to keep bumping rents. Again, very different from retail with 5, 10, 20-year leases, very different from student housing, etc. That's one of the huge advantages. There's more demand for self-storage than I think some people realize. I've seen it reported that 10% of Americans have a self-storage unit. We have a natural need for it between divorce, unfortunately, death, military. There's around 1 million active service members who need to put their stuff in self-storage. And then unfortunately, when times are, small businesses increasingly are using self-storage for storage. They don't want to have a warehouse or an office. They'd rather just put away things that they need, inventory in self-storage, so they rent a self-storage unit. There's this constant need. The maintenance to keep up a self-storage facility is actually very minor. In fact, some locations are going fully automated. They have a human walk the property maybe once a day, but it isn't the old model where you have a full-time staff or a couple that lives there. That's very typical in the old days. A lot of this can be done automated, including dispensing a key to a unit and renting or paying the rent, etc. Very low maintenance. If you don't have climate control in some parts of the country, very low cost and expense, and even with climate control, compared to an office building or even an apartment building, it's much lower on the maintenance end. It's easy to take care of. Big advantage of self-storage facilities. The risk of tenant default. I don't know if you've ever seen Storage Wars on TV. I love that show. It's true. Usually the leases will read that after 5 days you're in default, and usually if it's been 2 months that there's been no payment, there's a padlock on your unit, your stuff gets sold, and you get to release that unit. Again, maybe at a higher rate because of market rates increasing. It's a great way to mitigate control with deficiencies or defaults. Imagine 3 to 5 months it can take, certainly here in Southern California, to get a tenant out who's not paying rent. Obviously, I'm not speaking about the recent challenges with the pandemic, but in general. Well, in the storage world, it's very easy to get the tenant out. I can tell you, by the way, I hate to ruin the producer's story on Storage Wars. Usually you actually don't even get back the rent that's owed when they do that auction. But they are able to vacate the unit, collect some of the lost rent, and most importantly, release it to a paying tenant. And most of those tenants are on an auto pay on their credit card, and that actually also helps keep up the payments, the current rent being paid. Lastly, during the Great Recession, self-storage was the only asset class that increased its average NOI, or net operating income. Unfortunately, of course, because of all the displaced people that had to move out of their homes or apartments if they lost their job and put their stuff in storage. In good times, people buy stuff, and they tend to need additional storage beyond their living space. So a really good solid asset class. And just briefly, lastly, only about 20% of self-storage's facilities across the country are owned by a corporation, like we all see Public Storage or SmartStop or CubeSmart perhaps in other parts of the country. Those are professional operators that know how to run the property, keep up the current market rents, get rid of the tenants that aren't paying, and that's great. But the other 80% are frankly owned by mom and pops who often are not maximizing the rent. And guess what? If you're a buyer and you're a big institution, or you're a DST that has an excellent operator that's taking care of the property, then that's opportunity. That means that you can purchase the property at a lower price based on the income it's producing and the cap rate in that given market, which is how you determine value, and then increase the net operating income, bring the rents up to speed, get rid of the troublemakers and the defaulting tenants, and increase value. So a lot of opportunity in the self-storage space. Lastly, and then I'm going to talk about Delaware statutory trusts in particular as an option for 1031 exchange. Whether you're buying a property outright with new money, as I call it, or you're doing a 1031 exchange, the multifamily asset class, I believe, is probably the one that you would want to focus on for a number of reasons, and particularly high end. The higher end, the better. The more expensive, the better. Let me explain. Like self-storage, the lease terms tend to be 6 to 12 months and then month to month. Very important in investment real estate because that means, again, you can keep up market rates. By the way, many people are concerned, and I think rightfully so, that we're going to hit a period of inflation. Now, I've been thinking that and hearing that since 2009, and it hasn't happened because we have a government that is trying to control inflation, but perhaps to the detriment of the future. My point is, I don't have a crystal ball. Nobody knows what will happen. But there is a lot of belief from economists and people much smarter than I that believe we're going to see some pretty substantial inflation in this country at some point, and maybe for a long time. While we often think of the negatives of inflation, prices are rising, the issue also has an impact on earnings, on wages, on savings. Remember when interest rates were 10 or 12% for a CD? I bet nobody under 30 remembers that, but everybody else does. That was very common in the 80s, right? But also mortgages were 13%. So in other words, when we get into an inflationary environment and there's too much cash in the economy, prices rise overall. This is good and bad because it also means that you're able to raise rents again in a multifamily or in a self-storage or in any rental situation where you have the ability to increase rents. Going back to the triple nets, if you have 10 years remaining on the lease and inflation quadruples in that 10 years, guess what? Your tenant is still paying the rent that you agreed to 10 years ago. And that dollar has lost a tremendous amount of value so that you're collecting a pittance, essentially. It's very much like, think of folks in Santa Monica that have been under rent control since the 70s and are paying $400 or $500 for what would otherwise be $3,000 apartment. That's the kind of situation you run into. Well, in multifamily, because of the turnover and the month-to-month rent, you're able to increase rents and keep up with inflation and market rates. And you really can't do that in most other types of real estate. Number two, you can't sleep on the internet, as far as I know, and I don't think anybody's going to invent a way to do so. So as the internet expands, if anything, it's driving the need for housing and residence. It's not going to replace it because you have to sleep somewhere. You have to live somewhere. Our nation grows at around 1% nationwide on average per year. That's population and immigration, less deaths and migration. So there's always a built-in demand and need. Every market's a little bit different, of course. There's always a story. But generally, if you're in a market that's at or exceeding the national average of growth, and you're able to keep market rate rents up, whatever happens, you're going to have a solid investment that continues to cash flow during the hold, and that you can keep the rents up and the value up when you sell. I mentioned Class A because even though we're talking about apartments and multifamily, there's a big distinction between what is technically called B and C. Think of Class A as 10 years or less in construction, or luxury, or high end. And the reason I stress that is that B and C class, C would be Section 8 housing, for example. B is kind of middle of the road, generally older properties, generally smaller properties. Well, there obviously are a lot of challenges when we, for example, go through the Great Recession or through the pandemic last year on a lot of real estate, obviously including rent. And in fact, nationwide, using the pandemic as an example, even though it's not common, rent collection rates went to about 70% for multifamily. It's been reported 60% for retail, by the way. Do you know what it was for Class A multifamily, luxury, high-end new apartments? Went from about 98, 99% typically to 97, 96% generally at the lowest as an average. In other words, people on the higher end of the income scale, many of them are choosing to rent, first of all. You're competing sometimes with them buying a home. They generally have professional, higher-level, non-service industry jobs, so they can afford the rent that they're paying. There's this new group they call the millennials who are choosing to rent, even though the traditional pattern is to buy a home and, have the 1.4 kids and the dog and the white picket fence. Well, I see a big change just in my world around me, and I see it statistically. People are choosing to rent at a much higher rate than they have before. So the home ownership rate in the United States has been dropping, not just because of lack of availability, but lack of demand. People who can afford it, like these higher end properties. In the Great Recession, we all experienced here in Southern California a lot of challenges, as we all remember, but I bet not a lot of you lowered your rent, and certainly for the higher rent properties, Santa Monica, Beverly Hills, you most likely just left your rent flat. You maybe lost a tenant, but the bottom line is you didn't have to drop your rents a lot, and you didn't have massive default necessarily. There was an impact on multifamily, but it tended to be more dramatic on the lower end of the scale. So what I'm saying is that Class A newer multifamily it gets hit like everybody in a recession. Didn't get hit in the pandemic virtually at all. And that's because of the nature of the tenancy and the employment and the income of the tenants. It just tends to hold up better. And that's been seen statistically again through the Great Recession. The only thing that did better during those down years was self-storage, as I mentioned. Why do I talk about recession and pandemic? I like to think in terms of worst case scenario for my clients. My investors tend to be older, tend to be towards the end of their real estate ownership career. They're not eager to go out and buy a property and manage it and take care of it and improve its value and maybe hold it 20 years in case we go through a recession and then sell it at a profit. That's just not the model for our typical 70-year-old investor. Our clients are mostly concerned with preservation of capital, in other words, the money they've built up over the years in their real estate career, cash flow, because they like to see a check at the end of the month or they're living off their investments, and retirement. And appreciation, but appreciation is, you notice, third on my list. In other words, we want the property to grow in value, but we're not looking to hit a home run. We don't expect it to double in value. It's arguably a much more stable investment. So on that note, let me talk about 1031s and options that you have. First thing you have to decide is, do I want to sell? Is it the right time for me to sell? Understandable. Maybe at the top of the market, which I would argue we're in right now, it is a good time. You're going to get top dollar. But maybe you're happy with your tenants. You want to continue to hold the property. It's an individual decision that you have. We're not going to tell you when it's the right time to sell, because where the market is at any given time doesn't necessarily dictate what you decide to do. But if you sell, most people think they can either buy another real estate asset, do a 1031, and usually they tend to buy in the same market that they're selling in because it's what they know. So that means if you're selling at the top of the market, unfortunately, you're buying at the top of the market. Now you can go to a different market, but you become an absentee landlord. And I know that's a challenge for a lot of people. The other option is to pay your tax. You made your money, you've held real estate, maybe you've done a few exchanges. Let me cash out, take my chips off the table. Sometimes that's not a bad idea. I'm not here to tell you not to do that. What I will tell you is that on average, most people, if you figure out you are going to walk away with $500,000, let's say, in capital gain and profit when you sell your property, if you don't exchange between the federal capital gain and the state income and the federal depreciation recapture and the Medicare tax that still is in place, you're going to end up paying probably about a third or more of your net proceeds. So on $500,000, you're going to have $350,000 because $150,000 is going to go to the federal and state government. Not a real attractive option for you, but that might make sense if you need that liquid cash. Most people think that's the end of this story, that there's no other options. And I want to tell you that there is another option. It's not commonly known, and they are sold as private securities. So you have to be a financial advisor like myself and my business partner, Bob, to sell these investments. They're not allowed to be publicly advertised. And that's why most people, when they hear about DSTs, think it's a new thing. You see some of the properties, or they'll put up a picture of what they look like. They tend to be, I use the word institutional, very large, 50, 90, $70 million properties, very large assets. Occasionally you'll see a commercial. That Amazon property had more than 15 years remaining on the lease and was in a strategic distribution center location. So there are exceptions, as I said. But what it is a trust that's formed in the state of Delaware. Yes, I realize that's what it sounds like. It is exactly that. There are sponsor companies out there. They number about 40. Think of them as real estate investment companies and managers. They go out and scour the country and they find these properties. They acquire them. They do all the underwriting. Usually about 50% leverage or loan to value is utilized to purchase the property. They use 50% of their own money or lines of credit and 50% of debt, and they buy the property in the name of a newly formed DST. In other words, every property they purchase is a separate DST. A lot of people confuse this with REITs, R-E-I-T, or real estate investment trust. Those generally don't qualify for 1031 exchange. They're a whole different type of investment. Back in 2004, the IRS said if you structure the DST properly, you can bring in many investors and everybody owns their share, their fractional share, their pro rata percentage of the property. Banks love this structure because now you have maybe 50, 100 people. You could actually have up to 499 people owning an asset, but there's only one borrower. There's only one, and that's the DST itself. Investors come in doing 1031 exchanges typically with their own capital, and they buy a piece of that DST. So they're an owner of the DST, and the DST owns the real estate. The good news for you is that you get all the same benefits of individual ownership of real estate. Everything passes through very much like it would on your own property. Your share of the expenses, you write off the income. Your share of the distributable income, you receive monthly. The sponsor will pay you. When the property sells, whatever appreciation is out there, you receive 100% of your, let's say, 1%. That's required by the IRS. The value, loan to value I mentioned, is very conservative, especially these days, 50%. A lot of capital goes into these deals. That's good because even if it loses value, God forbid, you're still going to be okay. The bank's not going to come take the property away. The downside is that with lower leverage, you have lower cash flow. We're seeing 4.5% to 5.5% net cash on cash for these types of investments. The reason I mentioned the 499, that was a requirement in the revenue ruling that the IRS issued. You're not in business with those other people. Usually there's about 80 or 100. They almost never need that many investors. But the reason I mention it is because they can raise money from so many individual investors, they can have a much lower minimum. So typically I have a client with $300,000 that they need to reinvest. Maybe they paid off a loan for another $300,000. So IRS says you need to buy $600,000 in real estate and reinvest all $300,000 cash, usually by assuming a loan. Well, in the DST model, you can invest in 3 different properties, maybe in 3 different states, with 3 different sponsor companies. That's what I would generally recommend, although sometimes that doesn't work with the goals of the investor. But you're able to diversify in that manner because their minimums can be so low. They are typically about $100,000. And with each $100,000 you invest, because of the loan that the DST has, remember 50%, you actually own $200,000 in real estate for each one, and you're able to achieve that minimum required $600,000 in my example. The biggest appeal to the Delaware Statutory Trust model, like triple nets, is that it's passive. You don't need to deal with the day-to-day, no more toilets, tenants, termites. I'll add teenagers on there. All of the challenges that I know you as a viewer of this live stream are already aware of. You can make money and do really well owning investment real estate, and particularly multifamily real estate, but it's not easy, and I know that. Well, when you get to that point where, frankly, you don't want to own real estate like that, but you have to, otherwise you're going to lose a third of your investment, this is a great way to own real estate without really owning real estate. You have to be comfortable with who the sponsor company is. They have to have been around. That's what H&S Wealth Management will guide you through and assist you with. We only work with very seasoned companies that have full cycle track records. So they put together an offering, sold it to investors, operated it, usually for about 6 to 8 years. It's a typical hold period, and then sold it. And I can show you every sponsor's track record and experience. Not a guarantee, but at least you know they've been through this before, in good times and bad, because these companies all have 10 to 50 years experience and track record. Liquidity is the biggest question I get, and I bet many of you are thinking that right now. What if I want to get out? What if I don't want to wait the 6 to 8 years for that full-term cycle? Can I sell my DST interest, my share? And the answer is unequivocally yes. You have the right and the ability to sell your share of the property. There's no guarantee that someone will buy it or buy it at the price that you want. It's inherently an illiquid asset. All real estate is considered illiquid by the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission. You can't go to a market and push a button and sell it tomorrow. But you have the absolute right and ability to sell your DST interest. You may not be able to if times are bad and nobody wants to hold that DST interest, or you might be able to get even more than you paid. One interesting facet in the DST is there's a requirement in the DST agreement to make that interest available first to all your fellow co-owners of the safe property. It's called the right of first offer. You don't have to sell to them, but you have to offer it to them first. And guess what? They already own the property. They're already a high net worth individual because they're in the DST. They already know how it's doing because they own a piece of it. And maybe they'll buy a portion of your interest or all of your interest and grow their position. So you have a built-in market of typically 80, 60, 100 people who already are owners of the property who may want to expand their ownership. But again, as I said, when times are weak, you're going to have a real challenge. When you go into a DST, you really shouldn't be thinking of it as a parking vehicle. you're in it for the long haul, and that's what we recommend, and we stress there's no secondary market. But you do have the right and ability to sell if you can have all the other co-owners as your first option. Again, we only work with seasoned sponsors, people with full track records and experience. We have hundreds, without exaggeration, of clients over the years that work with these core companies that we work with, so we know them. That may not mean anything to you, but before we're even going to show them to you, we're going to know their story. We're going to know, in most cases, the senior people, the founders. We are already been working with them for years, so we know that you can rely on them. We just have to make that real for you. It's real estate. Remember that. I like multifamily for the reasons I've covered, and self-storage. And I like DSTs that are multifamily and self-storage for the most part. That's what we're going to focus you on. If you work with us on your exchange, might be now. If you're selling at the moment, work with Sara to get your property sold. I think you will get top dollar in today's market. Or maybe it's 6 months from now. That's okay. We realize this is a process. When the time comes, I haven't changed my story really since the Great Recession. I'm going to show you Class A multifamily from seasoned people, or maybe self-storage. And also, of course, anytime you buy real estate, think about the demographics. Think about the growth in that market and the job growth in particular, as well as population. So as you heard Jeff talk about, there's an opportunity for you to ask me questions now live in the chat box. This is our team, as you see on the screen. If you have a question, if you'd like a consultation, there's no cost or obligation. And if you'd like to see examples of some of the types of investment opportunities that I talked about in the DST space, please give me a call. Our 800 number's up there. I think my direct cell phone has been a banner ad there for you. Please reach out to me. Again, I understand if we're not a year down the line or 6 months down the line, or if you need to do something now. Either way, I think I can help you out. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Jeff.
Great, thanks. Wow, okay, very good stuff. You heard a lot of different options there. And before we go into the questions, I just want to again mention that this live stream was brought to you by H&S Wealth Management and AOA Brokerage and AOA as an association. We're here for you. We would love if you joined AOA, and there's a lot of member benefits. One of them is the brokerage, and they do a free property valuation for you. So if you're looking at selling and into a 1030 and make it with a 1031 exchange, you could sell it with AOA Brokerage and work with H&S Wealth on the 1031. And so that's a great way to do it, a great combination. And anyway, also just, again, don't forget that we have other live streams that are coming up. One at 12:30 about the rental assistance program. Next week we have Dennis Block. We have one on small claims, how to prepare for small claims court, and another a pathway to wealth. So there's a lot of different live streams coming up. Subscribe to the YouTube channel, and also subscribe to our e-newsletter, and get all that taken care of. But we're going to take questions. And the first question that I see here, let's see, it is on YouTube. Jane, what is your opinion on a medical office or urgent care net investment with a BBB plus credit tenant?
Great question. I did skip over medical office. And, there are a lot of good opportunities. There is a growing demand. If I had to do that type of investment for some reason, or if I were looking at it as an option, that might be one I would consider. BBB is not the greatest credit out there. If you actually read the fine print, there's still some issues potentially with that company. So keep that in mind, number one. And number two, and really most importantly, it goes back to the same fundamental. What is the term of the lease? Even though you're confident they're going to stay, medical offices, doctor's offices, dental facilities are actually what they call in our business very sticky. People tend to not move. Think about if you have your own doctor, not an HMO, how long they've been in their office location, right? Doctors don't like to move. It's expensive. They lose proximity to their patients. So they can be good investments. But you want to consider really these three things. Number one, the credit worthiness is the term of the tenant and what that really means. Number two, what is the term of the lease remaining? Because even if they're a great tenant, Kaiser, for example, are they still going to be wanting to renew that space in 6 or 8 years? And what if you want to or need to sell in 6 or 8 years? If you're selling with very little time remaining on the lease, you have to think ahead like that. That might be a big challenge. The other thing when it comes to medical is that there's a lot of unknowns. As we all know, there's been a push for the socialized healthcare in this country. That could change the metrics and the financials. I don't know that that's actually something that's going to happen, but the truth is I don't know that it's not. And anything that I'm unsure about makes me nervous. I'd like to know that this is a growing market, that people have to sleep somewhere, things like that. So there's more questions I have. But depending on the lease term, depending on the quality and location of the building, I forgot to mention, of course, and depending on the credit worthiness of the tenant, that may be a worthy investment.
Great. On Facebook, we have Christine. Any restriction for investing short-term non-real estate capital gain into a DST or QOF and not a 1031 exchange?
I think what you're asking about is what I call a new money or a straight investment. And is there an opportunity? There is. You don't have to be doing a 1031 exchange to invest in the DSTs that I talked about. They are designed for 1031 exchange. They are the only investment other than your own deeded real estate that qualifies for 1031. I would tell you that if you're just looking to invest in straight real estate, a DST might be a good option for you, and you will be able to exchange, do a 1031 when it sells 6 or 8 years down the line. But there are other types of investment in real estate that we work with, non-traded REITs, for example, or interval funds that can put you into 2,000 properties and that have quarterly liquidity events. So there are different types of investments. It depends on what your goals are, and it's a conversation, really.
Great. Next question, Charles on Facebook. What's to prevent the DST from treating the investments from keeping the funds in perpetuity and never having a liquidation event? So is there a contract with a exit, with a designated exit date, or how does that work?
It's a great question, a very sophisticated question, actually. There are some strictures, some rules around a DST and the way they're structured that the IRS issued in the revenue ruling that kind of control some of these things. One of the rules that they made is that a DST cannot be refinanced and technically cannot have a cash call. You can't add additional capital, you can't build on the property or what have you. So those are some of the rules around a DST. There's a couple of moving parts here that I have to explain, but briefly, technically the DST could be owned in perpetuity. Generally, the opportunity to sell at a profit is in that 6 or 8 year period. You remember Sara talked about real estate cycles being 8 or 9 years up, 8 or 9 years down, and that applies in the investment opportunity space as well, the DST space. So the right time to sell, first of all, by right time I mean at a healthy return, is generally going to be within 10 years, number one. Number two, there is a 10-year loan, a loan term of 10 years on these investments. So when you buy them, the loan will be up 10 years later, and generally the sponsor needs or wants to sell the property prior to the 10 years. Their goal is to sell the property, ideally make a double-digit return annualized, 5 or 6%, 4% cash on cash, and 4, 5, 6% appreciation. That's been the history. That's always the goal, sometimes more, sometimes less. And that happens usually, again, within that 10-year term. Now, I do want to qualify and say, what if you're in a situation like 2009 where it's a terrible time to sell? But as I just said, you're not able to extend the loan because of the strictures of the DST. The answer is every DST has a mechanism, a legal mechanism built into the structure that allows for you to have what's called a springing LLC. Basically, you take the DST, turn it into an LLC, not a tax event, not a sale, just changing the ownership. You'll go out and get that loan if you need to extend it or make a capital contribution. And then later you can convert back to a DST when the time comes to sell. That's basically a fail-safe if you have to hold longer. But your question was a concern that the sponsor is going to want to hold longer. And candidly, they have no motivation to do that. They make money when they purchase a property. They do a little markup and they get what they call an acquisition fee. And they have a disposition fee upon sale, the listing commission. So their motivation is very much aligned with yours. And technically, they're not able to hold it longer than 10 years anyway, other than an emergency.
Great, thanks. Thanks for that, Bryan. And this next question is for Sara. And have you seen anyone sell their property with the tenants, with non-paying tenants in the building?
Yes, thank you for that question.
That might be
Yes,
delayed,
we
but it was
definitely
supposed to be
have.
310.
We've seen buildings still being sold with tenants, non-paying, low rents paying, high rents paying. So it's still definitely something that you can do. If your tenants are not paying, don't let that stop you if this is the time for you to sell.
All right, thank you, Sara. And here's Raphael. What happens when you have a $1 million mortgage on a $2 million property? Do you have to replace the debt as well? Purchase a different building at $3 million, but keep a mortgage of at least $1 million? And that's, Bryan, I think that's for you.
Right. It's a great question. Your math is a little off because you said 3 million, but the answer is you've sold the property for 2 million. You paid off the loan of 1 million, and you have $1 million cash roughly left over. What the IRS wants you to do to complete a 1031 and avoid any tax liability on that sale is to reinvest equal or greater value, in this example, $2 million. So you have $1 million in cash. You can go buy a property and arrange for a new loan to replace the loan you paid off. Part of your gain comes from the debt portion. I know a lot of people confuse that and feel like they only, in this example, would need to reinvest $1 million because that's all the cash they have. But that's not what your capital gain is based upon. It's based upon the total value of sale, inclusive of debt. So your example is a perfect one where someone comes to, let's say me, and they're looking at reinvesting and doing a 1031 exchange. They paid off a $1 million loan and they have $1 million in capital. What we'll probably do is put you in 2 or 3 or 4 even different DSTs, because remember the minimums are low. Each DST is going to have about 50% loan to value, exactly the same leverage you had when you sold. So you're able to buy that 2 million of real estate with the 1 million of cash, but now it's diversified into several properties. That's what the IRS requires, whether you're doing a DST or purchasing your own property.
Great. Okay, here's the next question on Facebook. I'm currently in a 1031 exchange that I'm going to add a second property that they have an offer on. So I will combine both funds for an up leg, but I do need some of the funds. Can I do a partial exchange to extract some of the funds?
Absolutely. That is known as a partial exchange. And the way it would be structured, I think what you were saying is you're selling 2 different properties and you're able to reinvest in a single property, and that's perfectly fine. As long as you're purchasing, again, equal or greater value for both those sales, there's no prohibition from both property sales resulting in a single up leg. But your question had to do with boot or cash boot or mortgage boot. Any portion that's not reinvested, let's say you want to pull $20,000 out and take a great vacation, you absolutely are able to do. You would exchange the balance of your properties into whatever you're purchasing, DST or otherwise. And that $20,000 represents, let's say, 10% of your overall capital gain. Well, that 10% is now going to be due and payable to the state and federal governments. So that would trigger some, they use the word boot, but only that 10%. The other 90, you're deferring the tax on. Sometimes that's a great option for folks that need more liquid capital, and we recommend it.
Great, thanks, Bryan. All right, here's in the chat on the AOAUSA.com website. Can I sell a property I co-owned and do a 1031 exchange with just my portion?
That is also a good, sophisticated question. The issue is vesting or ownership. When you own a property, you record it with the county recorder, and it's owned in a certain facet. It could be by an individual, it could be by 2 individuals as joint tenants, or it could be 2 individuals as tenants in common, or it could be an entity. Like, for example, you and a partner created a partnership and bought real estate, or you formed an LLC, a multi-member LLC. Whatever the vesting is on the property sold needs to be reflected on the what we call upleg, replacement property. So if it's a LLC that's selling a property, That LLC needs to buy a property. And if there are multiple members in that LLC, that means you're stuck, you're married, you're connected. There is a tax opportunity that I would recommend you speak to your accountant about, but what I can tell you is that I have seen historically people that are in a partnership or in an LLC together that want to go their separate ways. You can do what's called a quitclaim and change the vesting. This is prior to you selling the property. You want to have a tenant in common interest. Okay, so that's fractional undivided interest. You can own half the property or a quarter of the property, whatever the percentage is based on your ownership. But if you have a tenant in common interest, some tax advisors will recommend wait a year or two after you've done this. That is not a requirement to my knowledge, although I think it's a best practice. That being said, once you own the property separately as a tenant in common owner, and your tenant in common might be in your family trust or in your name as an individual or in the name of a different entity, it doesn't matter. As long as it's a tenant in common interest that's exchanging, when the property sells, you go your way, the other tenant in common owner can go their way. The challenge is when you're in a partnership and the property sells, well, now the partnership needs to buy a property of equal or greater value, meaning if you break it up, you're not going to be able to, you're going to have a taxable boot for both of you in that example.
Great, thanks, Bryan. Okay, this next question is for Sara. What is included in the property valuation?
The property evaluation, I like to be very thorough. I almost think of it as a storybook about your building. So I just try to put as much information as I can because that will really tell us the value. And I think that you guys, just a little side note, should get these done once a year because tenants leave, the rents move, the market around you changes. So I think that you should always have an updated property analysis, different than a market analysis.
Got it. All right. And next question on YouTube. Scott, are you aware of any pushes to extend the time period to identify a new property? In the current market, it seems like there is not enough time to buy that next property. Bryan?
I'm still waiting for it to pop over, but I don't know if the folks can hear me right now. There we go.
Yeah, okay.
I love that question. I've actually never, that I can recall, had that question out of thousands. It's kind of a funny answer. I can tell you there's nothing on the books now or even expected to extend the 45-day requirement. To recap, if you're not aware, when you sell your property, you only have 45 days to identify to your accommodator who's holding your money to identify what you're going to purchase. There's a couple of different methods of nomination, but the real challenge is that you only have that 45 days, that's 6 weeks, and that is very tough. I know that, and I appreciate that. The funny part of the story is up until the 80s, you had to do it on the same day you sold your property. It was called a simultaneous exchange. And a long time ago, a gentleman by the name of Starker, and some of you might even remember 1031s being referred to as Starker exchanges, sued the IRS. And he said, you know, trying to buy something and close the same day I just sold my investment property is really tough. And the IRS said, too bad, and he sued him. And from my understanding, that case went on for nearly 20 years. And when it was finally settled, guess what? You can fight City Hall. He won it for all taxpayers. What he won was an extension from simultaneous exchange to deferred exchange. How long was the deferral? How long do you have after you sell to find something? 45 days. So bottom line, the IRS, you know, if you think of the IRS, do you know what that means? THEIRS? It means theirs. Some of you are writing it down and thinking about that. They're not eager for you to do an exchange. They love collecting tax money, as you already know. So they do like to make it hard for you. While investors would certainly like to have more than the 45 days to identify and 180 days to close, I don't see anything on the table that's going to extend that. It's been this way since the 80s. There has been talk about eliminating 1031. And if you look on the AOA USA YouTube page, there's a seminar I did talking about the Biden administration's proposed changes. Bottom line, if you have $400,000 more annual income, there was a proposal during the campaign to eliminate 1031 exchanges for those investors. but nothing is talking about an extension of the 45 days. Oh, and by the way, I see they put my direct line up. If you wrote down the 800 number, certainly you can call that and you'll reach my office. But I wanted you to be able to call me direct if you have a question later at that 310-903-6757. That is my direct line, and I'll be happy to talk to you and answer any additional questions you have.
Great. On YouTube, we have Mighty Lions. Do you have a lawyer firm referral to negotiate the triple N lease term renewal amendment that's favorable to landlord with a BBB plus long-term essential business tenant?
I'd refer you to, firstly, I don't know. It would be a real estate attorney you're looking for that negotiates leases, obviously, but generally speaking, your real estate broker is the one that would do that negotiation, that has experience. If they're a large enough firm like a CB Richard Ellis or a Marcus and Millichap, I'm not endorsing any, but if they're a national firm, they'll have a legal department. That's probably your best bet than going out and retaining a new attorney to negotiate the lease terms with you. That's really what I think most brokers, professional brokers, can do for you.
Great. On YouTube, Keith, if we exchange a 990,000 property for one that is 800,000, can we take the rest out to do upgrades to the new property?
The quick answer is no. That's going to be treated as boot or cash boot, meaning you've got that additional money and you're using it to improve the property you just bought, but it wasn't for equal or greater value. I could do a whole, and perhaps I should do another seminar on what's called build to suit or reverse exchanges, where there is an element of what you said that's possible, but in the example you given, it would not work. You would be paying tax on the 190, and that would be a partial exchange that you completed.
All right, here's Fred on YouTube. If you want to mention, you may want to mention that when selling a property, you can take some boot and reinvest the remainder in a DST.
Yeah.
This will give access to some cash and defer tax on the rest of that equity. So, Fred, that really wasn't a question. Does Fred work with you?
He doesn't actually, but he is reiterating what I said, and he is absolutely correct. Sometimes it makes sense, and sometimes depending on the net worth of the investor, we'll recommend pulling some capital out, paying the tax on that portion, and then you'll have liquid capital to put in the mattress or invest or what have you. Absolutely. But thanks for making that point, Fred. We did actually cover that, and I do recommend that in some cases.
All right, on Facebook, we have Charles. I have held several REITs for about a decade and still no liquidity event. Why don't DSTs have a maximum period in the contract like 10, 20, or 30 years?
There we go. Fred, I talked about this a little bit earlier, but the bottom line is there is essentially a prohibition from holding it longer than 10 years. It becomes very complicated if you're doing what's called a drop-in swap or a springing LLC. Why isn't there a requirement? Because it's real estate. And by that I mean it depends on market conditions. So there's really no way to dictate that this property will absolutely sell in the 9th year of ownership or what have you, because what if that's a terrible time to sell, right? So what happens is the DST, the trustee of the trust, the Delaware Statutory Trust, is the sponsor. You have to have a responsible party to have an obligation to take care of the trust to maximize its value, and to have the savvy and the knowledge and to know when it's the right time to sell. I'll reiterate, interestingly, several questions have been about a concern that they're going to hold the property too long, but usually what people are most concerned about is that they're going to sell it too soon. And of course, there's a balance there in between. But there's really no motivation to hold the property. The motivation is to sell it and maximize the return. As long as you're keeping the entity intact, you have to do that within 10 years because a property, a DST that has debt, and virtually all of them do, that are multifamily and self-storage, they're going to have to sell within 10 years unless it's an emergency. So that's really not a concern. You mentioned no liquidity event for your REIT. What you are talking about, I'm sure, is a non-traded REIT. And there is great opportunities, and some REITs do have quarterly liquidity events, but some don't. Some are just still waiting for an opportunity to either merge the REIT with another one or close it down and start selling the properties. Hopefully you're continuing to get dividends. But of course, in those types of REITs, you can't exchange anyways. So it's a different type of investment.
All right, on YouTube. Thank you, Adam. And here we go on YouTube. Teresa, could you comment regarding a New York cooperative?
I can comment that I love the bagels in New York. What you're talking about is what we more typically know as condo ownership, or a co-op of a condo where everybody owns a portion of it. If it's held for investment purposes, I've not dealt with anyone selling or a down leg sale. I believe, though, as long as it's an investment property and you're able to be deeded out separately, as I mentioned to the other question, you should be able to do a 1031 exchange. But I know there are some very unique rules to co-op ownership. And if I'm not mistaken, they're usually a primary residence, if not required to be a primary residence, in which case there's no 1031 opportunity anyway.
Okay, here's a question on YouTube from Munir. How does H&S make money from this service?
I love that question, actually. It's my favorite topic. No, it's a very fair question. There's a number of fees involved in costs. What I can tell you, and it really is the easiest to describe what we do, we are financial advisors. We have an obligation to do what's best for our clients and find them suitable investments, first of all. Secondly, we're paid through the deal. By that I mean when you purchase a DST interest, all the expenses, things like the closing and escrow, the typical things, the underwriting reports that were done, because there are substantial studies done on these properties, environmental, property physical condition reports, comps, appraisals, of course. All of those costs are baked into the price that you're paying. And as a result, the net yield, once you own the DST interest, is net of all those expenses, both in the first year and on a go-forward basis. So when I talk about 4.5%, 5.5% net cash on cash, that's after everything's paid. No additional costs when you purchase the property are out of your pocket. Everything comes from your exchange fund. So nobody is sending H&S Wealth Management a check. How does H&S make money? We receive a commission, a fee, very much like I like to liken it to what Sara does, to a buyer, a broker in that example, where you're representing the buyer in the transaction and the seller technically is paying a commission. That commission is usually about 2 to 3% of the total purchase price of the DST. So we get paid very much like a real estate agent would typically.
Okay, great. Thanks, Adam. Here we go. The next question on YouTube is Frank. If you sell in California and do a DST exchange to Nevada and also move to Nevada, would there be any state tax on the DST sale later when you're in Nevada? Trying to avoid those California taxes.
It's wisely, I think, and it's a great question and a great opportunity. So for those who don't know, Nevada is one of 8 states and jurisdictions in the United States that has no state income tax. That means that the portion of any capital gain you experience would not be taxed at an ordinary income rate like it would in the other 42 states. You would, of course, still owe federal taxes, which generally is 15, could be 20%, and the 3.8% Medicare tax and the depreciation recapture. That's a federal tax. What you asked, though, is an excellent question about moving, whether it's a state with no income tax or another state that has income tax. How does that work? You know how our state animal, anybody remember what it is from school? It's the bear, of course, on the seal of the state of California. Why do I mention the bear? Because California has something called a clawback. What does a clawback mean? If I own the property in California and I bought it in the year 2000, and in the year 2005, I sold the property, but I did a 1031 exchange and reinvested in another state, the state of California wants you every year to give an update to the state of California, even if you're filing in another state in the future, or if you're in a state like Nevada with no income tax, on the status of the property. Why do you need to continue to make this claim? When and if you eventually sell the property in whatever state it's located in, and you experience a capital gain, for that 5 years in my example, 2000 to 2005, that it was located in California, part of the gain is attributable to that period of time, right? Well, the state of California will tax you just on that portion, the value or the capital gain between, in my example, 2000 to 2005. In other words, they claw back the gain that that you experienced, but only for the time that you were a resident of California. I believe Pennsylvania has a similar clawback, and maybe a few other states. It's pretty rare. It's hard to keep track of. But technically, when you move out of state, you're required to continue to notify California of your future exchanges. And if you ever cash out, as I call it, or sell the property and pay the tax, they want their pound of flesh.
Well, I like the state bear, but I don't know if I like that clawback.
No.
Here you go on Facebook, Carol. Does your sale property need to be removed from a family trust to be ready for a 1031?
No, Carol. First of all, again, a whole other topic, but generally it is a good idea to own your real estate in some form of a trust or a family trust. In other words, you could be vested as an individual owner, you could be vested as a tenant in common owner in the example of co-ownership. But however you hold your assets, I should say, not just your real estate, maybe even your home and your brokerage account, ideally you have it in a family trust. There are a number of protections that provides for, and most importantly, it avoids probate, which can be a long and lengthy process for your heirs. But to answer your question, as I mentioned earlier, again, whatever the entity vesting is, let's say it's in your family trust and you own it outright and you sell it, whatever you purchase should be in the name of that same family trust. IRS does not want to see vesting change. That could potentially trigger a default on the 1031 or invalidate it. So if you were to buy another property on your own, you want to take it in the name of that same family trust that you just sold. And if you reinvested with H&S and you did some DST investments, your beneficial membership that I mentioned, your piece of the DST you own, will be in the name of the family trust. Now, if you want to change things, you certainly can do that, but you don't want to do it generally around the time of the exchange. In other words, make the change well ahead of selling or make the change subsequent to closing so that there's a record that the trust sold the property and the trust bought a property.
All right, Richard on YouTube, what happens if you do not identify a new property to purchase within the first 45 days?
You have your checkbook, Richard? There's really no option. As I mentioned with the Starker story, the IRS is eager to collect those taxes. So there's essentially no fail-safe. There's two possibilities called a 1033, and that's when one of two things happen. A declared natural disaster makes it impossible for you to identify in 45 days, or eminent domain, where the government forces you to sell your property. In that example, they actually give you 2 to 3 years to make those purchases, but only in those unique examples. There was an emergency with pandemic last year. Essentially, if you closed escrow, I believe around February the 2nd, you had until July 15th. So there was, and that might be why I'm getting these questions, there's probably a little confusion. There was a very unique opportunity where the IRS, just like they made our tax day, not for April 15th this year, but May 17th, they extended the 45 days because of the pandemic, because they realized the government was asking us all to stay home, and that made it difficult for the nomination. That ended July 15th, the year 2000. And again, there's nothing on the books or anticipated to change that. So we're pretty solid on that 45 days. I will tell you, if you planned on exchanging and you had your money transferred to an accommodator, which is required when you do an exchange, and you're approaching that 45th day, and it looks like you're not going to be able to complete the exchange, that you are going to be stuck, your accommodator should be telling you this, but I'll just give you a little tip. Be sure to pull your cash out of the accommodator's account to your personal account before the 45th day. There's a weird requirement that if it's after the 45 days, the accommodator's holding your money and you're not able to, or you're choosing not to exchange, they're required to hold your funds for 180 days. That's something a lot of people don't know, but it really very rarely actually happens. But in that example, if you were planning on exchanging and you're approaching your 45th day and you're either deciding not to exchange or you can't find anything, you want to pull cash out before the 45th day, meaning instruct your accommodator to wire funds to you so that you have access to your funds. Otherwise, they are required to hold it 180 days from the close of your escrow, 6 months.
All right, and what if they had listed some different properties and all of them fell through? Is there a way to get that put into a DST before the 45th day, or do you have to declare that from the very start that you're going to do the DST?
Yeah, it's the same answer. There really isn't, other than the exceptions, the 1033 and last year because of the pandemic. Whether it's a DST or your own real property, whatever you've identified to your accommodator. Most people use the 3-property rule, which of course means you can identify 3 properties and you must purchase one or some or all of them. There's actually a couple of other rules that allow you to nominate up to 200% of the value of your sale, or unlimited properties as long as you buy 95%. That's the 200% rule and the 95% rule. But regardless, whatever rule you're using with your accommodator to nominate, if the deals fall through, unfortunately, you're stuck paying the capital gain. What I will tell you is I have clients on occasion who like the DST, but they really want to buy a property in Big Bear, let's say, and their own property. So what I recommend to them is, first of all, do what makes the most sense for you. It's okay if we're not putting you into a property if that's what's best for you. Eventually, I think the DST will be perfect for you because I know what happens in typical real estate cycles, and I know that people continue to get older. But in that example, let's say the investor would much rather own their own asset. Great, do that. But if you're not confident that you can close, or you haven't received deposit and so forth, you probably want to have a backup nomination, and that may be another property on your own. What I will tell you is one advantage of the DST structure, if you name it as a backup, we'll be able to work with you, and you should know that it's going to be there waiting for you if you pass those 75 days and if your Big Bear purchase, in my example, falls through. It's a good backup option for you. The reason it is because you're not pending a closing. In other words, the sponsor already closed on the DST. The property is owned. It has a loan in place. It's operating and cash flowing, hopefully, but generally. Is waiting there for you. And in fact, you can close very quickly in a DST within a week because there's no title, there's no escrow. Remember I said you get credit for the debt, but you're not directly on the loan of the DST. The lender doesn't even know who you are, interestingly. So basically, it's up to you to pull the trigger and say, I'm ready to reinvest in this DST. If you nominated it along with another property, maybe you're not going to invest in the DST and you'll close on that other property and everything's great. But in that example, if that other property fell through, as long as you nominated the DST, you worked with us to make sure it was available to you, you could then, as a backup, go into the DST rather than pay the tax. It's a good solution for some of my clients.
Great. Here's Mighty Lions. For DST, does it matter which state you reside in? For example, if you live in Utah, do you need to go with a broker DST that's based in Utah?
No, you can purchase anything. If you've sold in the continental United States, then you can, not the continental, within the United States and territories is what I meant to say, then you have to buy something in the United States or in the territories. If you sold something internationally, say in Mexico, you can do a 1031 exchange, but you must purchase something internationally. So that's the only prohibition on geographics. You have to, if you're buying in the U.S., you have to buy U.S. property. If it's international, you have to buy international property. As far as your state of residence, though, no, the sponsors are the big ones are in New York, Chicago, Orange County, and a few other states. Texas has a couple. Where the sponsor's based really doesn't matter. And of course, they're buying properties all over. We generally like the Southeast. We work with sponsors that buy in Tennessee and DC and Virginia and Florida and Texas because that's where the growth is in the country. That's where the population and the job growth is. But it could be anywhere in the country, and your state of residence doesn't matter. You need to work with a broker, an advisor who's licensed in your state, but that's just anybody who's making a purchase for you that's a security. The actual DST can be anywhere.
And so, and with that, are you guys, you're nationwide, is that correct? Or do you operate only in California, or what's your area that you cover?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, we work with clients nationwide. The bulk of our business and our relationships are, as you can imagine, Southern California. We are Southern California based. Talk about the internet and how people are virtual. Our broker-dealer, who technically enables us to operate and that we hang our securities license with, is out of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, McDermott Investment Services. So bottom line, I've received leads, had referrals, done some business with people in many states across the country, including the East Coast. Sometimes I fly out and meet with them. Sometimes everything is done over the phone. It just depends. But if you're not a California resident and you want to talk to us about DSTs, regardless of where you live, we're happy to, and we can accommodate you.
And we have a question here. Speaking of referral fees, do you offer broker referral fees?
I'm going to assume here that we're talking about real estate agent or real estate broker referral
Right.
fees.
Yeah.
And the answer is no, and in fact, it's illegal. In order to be involved in a transaction of a security, especially a private security like a DST, you have to be securities licensed with the SEC and registered with FINRA. So I know that there are some firms that say they'll pay real estate agents essentially under the table. That's not proper, it's not allowed, it's not legal. And we certainly don't do that. We only work with folks that are referred to us. Usually they're either clients that have had good experience or other professionals like tax or attorney folks that have clients that we can help. But as far as opportunity to receive a portion of the fee, you have to be licensed with a broker-dealer, and that's the only way you can receive compensation.
Great. Here's Teresa. Is it possible to sell a residential rental property using a 1031 exchange and splitting the proceeds into a smaller value rental and a DST?
Sure. You again can take one property sale and reinvest in multiple properties, which I often recommend. DST properties are your own, as you just described, a smaller rental. Maybe you have some leftover equity. $50,000 or $100,000. Sometimes folks will, rather than pay the tax on that, they don't need the cash, they'll name the DST and reinvest in the DST with a portion of their proceeds. So you absolutely have that opportunity to do that. And in fact, I'd recommend it. If you're reinvesting in DSTs only, again, I'll probably want you to, or at least depending on your circumstance, I'll recommend 2 or 3 DSTs so that all your money's not in one property.
Yeah, we have someone asking a question about how you're different, how do you compare to a competitor? But I won't mention the name, but I'll just say, how would you differentiate H&S Wealth in among your competitors?
That's a great question. In a number of ways. I would say first and foremost experience, and I do believe experience matters. My business partner, Bob, has been doing this over 25 years. I'm approaching I'm in my 19th year. We've been around and we've stayed around through the years with our clients. We have many repeat clients. So the first thing I would ask or wonder about is working with another advisor. They may be a great individual. How much experience do they have in this industry? How much business have they done? How well do they know the sponsors, the ins and outs of the structure, and so forth? We pride ourselves on being not a very aggressive. There certainly is some competition out there, but we just feel that it's good business to do the right thing by people, and they tend to respond to that. Another big differentiator, I would argue, is this mention I've made several times about our focus on multifamily and self-storage. It actually limits our opportunity. We certainly can sell all kinds of DSTs, but we eliminate a good portion of those out there and only present certain ones with experienced sponsors that are selling Class A multifamily, maybe Class B plus, or self-storage. Most of the people in our industry, they tend to kind of show you everything that's out there and, take an order and say, I'll sell you whatever. And we like to think that part of what our compensation is based on is our expertise and advice and counsel. So that differentiates us. Lastly, there are some companies, and I honestly don't know the company you're referring to, that anybody remember Pete Rose? It's a baseball reference for some of you. He was a manager player, if you recall. Some of the folks out there actually are the sponsor themselves. In other words, they're actually the company putting the offering together, and then they have their own reps selling their own deals. Not necessarily anything inherently wrong or illegal or immoral or anything about that, but there is an inherent conflict of interest. So H&S and Wealth Management does not put together any investment offerings ourselves. We're strictly independent brokers. We pick and choose amongst the sponsor companies that are out there. If H&S was selling an investment offering and I was focusing my sales efforts on just H&S profit and sales, then I would consider that a conflict of interest, that they're not necessarily giving you the best offering, they're giving you their boss's offering. Some companies do that, we don't.
Great. And here's a good question. What are your thoughts on the industrial warehouse market? Is it overpriced?
Really savvy crowd today. I like this. An excellent question. This person, and for the audience, if you're not aware, really warehouse and distribution or industrial is kind of the hot ticket right now, along with self-storage in the commercial or investment real estate space. Why is that? Or remember that internet we talked about earlier. As a result of that, you need to have a lot of distribution ability. That's how Amazon is able to get it on your doorstep the next day. And so as a result, if any of you have been to the Inland Empire or Las Vegas recently or up north around Sacramento, all of a sudden you're seeing these football-sized buildings pop up, right? And that's warehousing and distribution. That's the sort of the newest asset class that's taking off. I didn't address that in my talk today because they are fairly tough and few and far between in the DST space, but I do like those investments. The only problem is we're back to the lease terms. If you recall in my presentation, I had a picture of an Amazon distribution center, but that had a 15 years or more, I think it was 18 years remaining on the lease as an example. So you still have to be cautious about the lease. And again, if you lose the tenant, do you want to own this mile-long building, because they're very large buildings, without a tenant that's paying the rent? So it's a consideration. But that being said, there are opportunities out there. They tend to be very expensive. Mostly they're not for individual buyers because they're multi-millions. But there is good opportunity out there because of the growing demand. Remember I said 20% of retail sales nationwide, it's projected, is online. Only 20%. I keep stressing that because that means we have a lot to go. It may not ever be 100%, but certainly a lot of that 80% is going to go online, and that's going to mean more of a need for warehousing, distribution, and what they call last mile, meaning they can get it from a distribution center to your house in 1 or 2 days.
Adam, we've answered 24 questions. Not bad.
Not
And
bad.
all of you, you've really held on for a long time. And I just thought if you've held on for this long and you're here, I thought, you know what, I want to offer them something. AOA has a property management software. If you are interested in giving it a try, we'll give you a try for 4 months free. You call Jeff, leave a message for me at AOA, and we'll give you a 4 months trial. We have one more question here we'll ask, and unless a couple more pop up all of a sudden. And so here we go on YouTube. We have we heard a presentation from several DSTs. What should be the selection criteria? Maybe
Great question. And you know what? And I'm fine with questions. I love questions. And I realized I didn't fully answer the last question, which was, do I think that industrial and warehouse distribution is overpriced? Overpriced is a relative term, right? It depends on what the market will bear. If there are buyers that are willing to pay the price that you're asking, that's the market value. So I couldn't call it overpriced. When I said it was hot, I meant there was a lot of demand, and that naturally is making the prices rise. But do I think it's a good investment is really what I think your question was. And as I said, depending on the lease terms, I do, and the tenant, of course. With regard to the criterion, a couple of things. I want to know, again, that there's some stability in the cash flow. I want to know that it's as reliable as we can project a property. That's why I worry about short-term leases on commercial, for example. How do I know that? Well, the biggest thing is location. I know it's going to come as a shock to real estate investors, but the 3 rules of real estate are location, location, and I always forget the third one. Where is the property located? That's the very first question any savvy advisor is going to ask. Now you have to drill down. Okay, it's a good market. Let's say Austin, Texas. I'm just picking randomly. Well, in this area around the property in Austin, Texas, in a 1, 3, and 5 mile radius, what is the vacancy rate for the properties? What is the demand? Importantly, what is the pipeline of growth, of development? The biggest challenge to multifamily, I've said a lot of good things about it, and I believe in it, but I can tell you that the things that cause trouble is overbuilding, when there's too many units and not enough people. So you want to know what the pipeline is, and any qualified sponsor knows that because it's recorded publicly with zoning and entitlements, at least for the next 2 or 3 years. You can't project much beyond that because it's an unknown. What's the growth pattern been, the demographic growth? Are they growing more than the national average? What's the job growth? What's the unemployment situation? All of these to me are the big factors. And I like to know the resident income. which is often available because the sponsor has the rent roll and is usually already operating the property. Why? Because higher income people tend to be safer bets. It's just as simple as that. They tend to pay the rent on time, and more likely when they move out, usually it's to purchase a home or they've had a life change and what have you. And as I mentioned, that's not a bad thing. You're able to bring in a new tenant at a higher rate. Nothing wrong with middle or lower income tenants. Nothing wrong with those types of investments because there are opportunities there. But there are more challenges than in the Class A space. So if I'm looking at a brand new property, the age of the property also, in a growth market where jobs exist, where there's a higher income tenant base, and there isn't a whole lot of product coming, meaning competing apartment buildings being built, that's the main criterion that I would argue is what you want to look at.
Great. Wow, we got a flurry of questions here, and you're
Yep.
good on time, right?
Cool.
Okay, Tony, what can your office act as the 1031 exchange accommodator?
And what is the fee? No, we're not an accommodator. An accommodator is kind of a specialized industry, and we have a couple that we recommend. Exchange Right does a lot of work with the AOA, and I think they would also refer you to them. They're down in San Diego. Any accommodator you work with, you want to make sure that they're bonded, that they have no commingling of funds, that they have individual accounts, meaning they are sort of like the trustee of your funds, but they can't move your funds. Only you can do that with your signature. They're going to charge, ballpark is around $1,000 is the bottom line. I think sometimes $800 or $950 for one property, and if you reinvest in 2 or 3, they may tack on another $400 or $500. That's the usual model. If you're being quoted in the thousands, that's too much. But you want to deal also, I would argue, very much like my theory with sponsors, with seasoned companies. Exchange Right, Exeter 1031, Safe Harbor. I'm rattling off different names. I like all these companies, so I have no referral business other than just giving those names out to people. But that's what you want to deal with. H&S never acts as the accommodator. We never receive funds from you. We're only paid by the sponsors, the sale commission. And we just recommend being with somebody that you don't have to be nervous about holding your money.
Great. On Facebook, we have, do all DST brokers have the same pool of DST properties available for sale?
We don't, no. There is about, I think on last count, there's an industry report that just came out, and there's about 40 or 39 sponsor companies that are doing registered DST offerings. So there's basically 40 companies out there. As I mentioned, we only work with 6 or 7 of them because we want the experienced ones that do multifamily and self-storage. All these companies out there that have offerings, at any given time they may have 1 or 2, they may have none if they're a smaller company. They go out to what's called the independent broker-dealer network to have what are called selling agreements. So in other words, they don't raise money directly, like I think I mentioned earlier about a certain company that does do that. They generally are going to go out to other companies who do their own due diligence on the offering and on the sponsor, and then if they approve it, they have what's called a soliciting broker agreement. If that company has 5 soliciting brokers, then those 5 are able to sell that sponsor's offering, that DST. My broker-dealer may very well not want to engage in a selling agreement. They might not have interest in selling that DST. It's a nice thing about DSTs, I always say, is there's a lot of eyeballs. When you look at a property on your own, you trust your own eyeballs first, of course. But in a DST, you have the bank who's done a very careful job of underwriting the property and has given you, the sponsor, a list of companies that they'll accept reporting from. In other words, independent third parties. So they do the appraisal, they do the condition report. You don't want the sponsor doing that because they're biased. They want to sell you their deal. Then they have to go out and sell broker-dealers to turn around and sell their deals to their clients through their advisors like me. So a lot of people are looking at these offerings before it ever reaches your desk. And frankly, a lot of them that land on my desk, I don't even show to people, or at least I let them know it's available, but I don't recommend. So does everybody have the same? No, there's some that most have because they're the largest or the biggest and have the most selling agreements with all these different individual companies out there. But you'll see a pretty wide diversity in what people have available. And in my case, as I said, what people like, what they recommend to their clients, is we are not all equal.
Great. Thanks, Adam. Okay, here's Hannah. Looks like it's the last question. Can you do a 1031 exchange but pay off California taxes so you don't have to file every year?
File the clawback, I think she's
Yeah,
referring to. Well,
right.
the problem is you would have to sell the property to know what the capital gain is. You're saying for the period of time you were in California, but it depends on your total gain. In other words, you could be potentially losing some money, and that would impact your tax payment. So to my knowledge, and I'm going a little out of school here, I don't think there is any way to come to an exact gain in the period of time that you were in Southern California. But possibly you could, I guess. I would recommend you talk to tax counsel on that. That's a bit of a tricky question.
Right. And then also just the concept of money, the value of money today versus the value of money tomorrow. If you can push it off, then it's more in your benefit, it would seem like. So, all right. So no more questions. I think we answered all of your questions. Thank you for tuning in. 12:30, we have another live stream. Next week, we have one. And so just go ahead, subscribe, and also join AOA and become a member if it's been a while or you've never done it before. If you haven't, you actually get a 100% money back guarantee if you're joining for your first time. We're confident that we're going to be able to help you make and or keep more money. And Adam, real thankful for you, thankful for H&S Wealth and just providing this opportunity for everyone to hear and learn and hopefully make good investment choices. Thank you very much. We'll see you later.